The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of the royal estate, but inside the grand palace walls, darkness seemed to have settled permanently. Catherine sat in her private study, staring at the official letter that had arrived just hours earlier. The royal seal felt cold beneath her fingertips as she read the words that would change everything forever. Camilla had been planning this moment for months, perhaps even years. Every smile, every public appearance, every carefully orchestrated family gathering had been building toward this single, devastating blow. The letter was formal, written in the language of royal protocol, but its message was crystal clear. Catherine was no longer welcome in the family home. The reasons cited were vague, wrapped in diplomatic language about irreconcilable differences and the need for family harmony, but Catherine knew the truth behind every carefully chosen word. The children had been at their lessons when the letter arrived. Prince George, now tall for his age with his father's earnest eyes, had been practicing his French with his tutor. Princess Charlotte, spirited and intelligent beyond her years, had been working on her mathematics. Little Prince Louis, still so young but already showing signs of the family's strong will, had been in the nursery with his nanny. They had no idea that their world was about to crumble around them. Catherine remembered the first time she had noticed the change in Camilla's behavior. It had been subtle at first, like the way shadows lengthen so gradually you don't notice until suddenly it's dark. There had been small slights during public events, carefully timed interruptions during important conversations, and strategic exclusions from family meetings. Camilla had mastered the art of making Catherine feel unwelcome while maintaining the perfect facade of royal propriety. The breaking point had come during the family's summer retreat at Balmoral. Catherine had been discussing the children's education with the king, sharing her hopes for their future and her concerns about maintaining their privacy while preparing them for their royal duties. It was a conversation she had looked forward to, a chance to bond with her father-in-law and ensure her children's well-being. But Camilla had entered the room with that particular smile she reserved for moments of calculated destruction. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Camilla had slowly, methodically, turned the conversation against Catherine. She questioned Catherine's judgment, her priorities, even her love for her children. With surgical precision, she planted seeds of doubt in the king's mind about Catherine's fitness as a mother and a royal. The king, already struggling with the pressures of his new role and wanting to keep peace in his household, had been all too willing to listen. William had been away on official duties, representing the crown at a Commonwealth summit. Catherine had tried to reach him, but the time differences and his packed schedule made meaningful conversation impossible. By the time he returned, the damage had been done. The family dynamics had shifted, and Catherine found herself isolated, facing a united front of royal disapproval. The children sensed something was wrong long before the adults were ready to explain. George had started asking why Grandma Camilla looked at Mummy differently now. Charlotte had noticed that family dinners had become tense affairs with conversation that felt forced and artificial. Louis, in the way that very young children do, had begun clinging to Catherine with an urgency that broke her heart. As Catherine sat with the letter in her hands, she could hear the children playing in the garden below her window. Their laughter drifted up through the open air, innocent and carefree, completely unaware that their lives were about to be turned upside down. She knew she would have to tell them soon, but how do you explain to children that sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they're supposed to love and protect? The letter gave her 48 hours to make arrangements. 48 hours to pack up a life, to say goodbye to the only home her children had ever known, to prepare them for a separation that would wound them in ways they wouldn't understand for years to come. The cruelty of the timeline wasn't lost on her. Camilla knew exactly how devastating this would be, and she had calculated the timing to maximize the impact. Catherine walked to the window and watched her children play. George was helping Louis build a fort out of garden chairs and blankets, while Charlotte directed the operation with the authority of someone destined for leadership. They worked together with the unconscious teamwork of siblings who had grown up secure in their family's love. In less than 2 days, that security would be shattered. The staff had already begun to whisper. News travels fast in a royal household, and Catherine could see the mixture of sympathy and uncertainty in their eyes. Some of them had worked for the family for decades, had watched William grow up, had welcomed Catherine with genuine warmth when she joined the family. Now they found themselves caught between loyalty and duty, unsure of how to navigate this unprecedented situation. Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from her sister Pippa. Word was already spreading beyond the palace walls, carried by the network of connections that linked royal staff to the outside world. Soon the media would catch wind of the story, and then the real nightmare would begin. The speculation, the analysis, the attempts to assign blame and motive to what was fundamentally a family tragedy played out on a public stage. She thought about her own childhood, growing up in a loving home where conflict were resolved with conversation and compromise. Her parents had taught her that families worked through their problems together, that love and understanding could overcome almost any obstacle. But the royal family operated by different rules, where tradition and protocol often mattered more than personal relationships, where saving face could be more important than protecting hearts. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being forced to leave by a woman who had herself been an outsider once. Camilla had faced her own struggles to gain acceptance within the royal family, had endured years of public scrutiny and criticism. Catherine had hoped that shared experience might create a bond between them, but instead it seemed to have made Camilla more determined to protect her own position at any cost. As afternoon turned to evening, Catherine began the heartbreaking task of deciding what to take with her. The children's favorite toys, their comfort blankets, the books they loved to read together. She packed photo albums filled with memories of happier times, when the family had felt whole and secure. Each item she placed in the suitcases felt like another piece of their old life being carefully wrapped and stored away. The children came in from the garden as the sun was setting, their faces flushed with exercise and happiness. They chattered about their day, about the games they had played, and the adventures they had planned for tomorrow. Catherine listened with a smile that felt like it might crack her face, knowing that tomorrow would bring no adventures, only explanations and tears, and the beginning of a new chapter none of them had wanted to write. Dinner was a quiet affair. The usual staff seemed subdued, and even the children sensed the change in atmosphere. George, always sensitive to adult emotions, kept glancing at his mother with worried eyes. Charlotte tried to fill the silence with stories about her lessons, but her usual exuberance felt forced. Louis, tired from his day in the garden, fell asleep in his high chair, his small hand still clutching a toy soldier. After putting the children to bed, Catherine sat alone in her study one final time. The room that had been her sanctuary, her place of peace within the controlled chaos of royal life, would belong to someone else by the end of the week. She wondered who would sit at her desk, who would look out at the garden where her children had played, who would inherit the carefully curated life she was being forced to abandon. The letter lay on her desk where she had left it that morning, its formal language and royal seal a stark reminder of how quickly security could disappear. Tomorrow she would have to begin the conversation she had been dreading, the one that would explain to 3 young children why their family was breaking apart and why their mother had to go away. As she finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Catherine caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her seemed older than she had that morning, marked by the weight of decisions she hadn't made but would have to live with forever. In less than 48 hours, she would walk out of this house as a different person, no longer the secure mother and wife she had been that morning, but something new and uncertain, carrying the pieces of a broken family and hoping somehow to build something better from the fragments. The children slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that this would be one of the last nights they would all sleep under the same roof. Catherine stood in each doorway for a long moment, memorizing their faces in the soft glow of their night lights, storing up these last moments of innocence before she would have to break their hearts with the truth. The morning came too quickly and too slowly all at once. Catherine had barely slept, lying awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her family. By dawn, she had made her decision about how to tell the children. She would be honest, but gentle, giving them information they could understand without burdening them with the adult complexities that had created this situation. George was already awake when she checked on him, staring at the ceiling with the serious expression he wore when he was thinking hard about something. At 9 years old, he had developed an intuitive understanding of the adult world around him, often picking up on tensions and emotions that the adults thought they were hiding. When Catherine sat on his bed, he immediately sat up, as if he had been waiting for this conversation. Charlotte and Louis were still asleep, and Catherine decided to speak with George first. As the oldest, he would help her find the right words for his younger siblings. She explained that sometimes grown-ups made decisions that affected everyone in the family, even when those decisions were hard to understand. She told him that she would be leaving the house, but that her love for him and his brother and sister would never change, no matter where she lived. George listened with the gravity of someone much older than his years. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time before asking the question she had been dreading. "Did we do something wrong, Mummy?" The pain in his young voice nearly broke her resolve to stay strong. She pulled him close, reassuring him that this situation was entirely about adult disagreements and had nothing to do with the children's behavior or worth. Waking Charlotte and Louis proved even more difficult. Charlotte, at 7, had her father's emotional intelligence combined with a fierce independence that made her ask direct, uncomfortable questions. She wanted to know exactly why Mummy had to leave, who had made this decision, and whether they could fight it. Her sense of justice was outraged by the unfairness of the situation, and Catherine found herself in the impossible position of trying to explain adult politics to a child who saw the world in terms of right and wrong. Louis, at 4, simply didn't understand. He kept asking when Mummy would come home, as if this were a temporary trip rather than a permanent separation. Catherine realized that for him, the concept of leaving didn't carry the same weight it did for his older siblings. To Louis, people left and came back. That's what travel meant in his limited experience of the world. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Catherine had arranged for a small apartment in London, a temporary refuge where she could begin to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. It wasn't the spacious, secure environment the children were used to, but it was a place where she could be herself without the constant scrutiny of royal protocol. The packing was methodical but heartbreaking. Each item that went into the suitcases represented a choice between what mattered most and what could be replaced. The children wanted to help, not understanding that their mother was trying to fit an entire life into a few bags. They kept bringing her things they thought she might need. George's favorite book that he wanted to share with her, Charlotte's lucky bracelet that she insisted would keep Mummy safe, Louis's stuffed elephant that he was sure would help her not be lonely. Camilla made several appearances throughout the day, each visit calculated to increase the emotional pressure on Catherine. She would arrive with some minor administrative detail to discuss, but her real purpose was to ensure that Catherine understood the finality of the situation. There would be no changing of minds, no last-minute reprieve, no opportunity for reconciliation. Camilla had one, and she wanted Catherine to fully understand the scope of her defeat. The most painful moment came when William finally returned from his official duties. Catherine had hoped that seeing his children's distress might change his perspective, that he might finally stand up to his stepmother and fight for his family. Instead, he seemed worn down by the conflict, caught between his loyalty to his father and stepmother and his love for his wife and children. The conversation they had was stilted and formal, full of legal necessities and practical arrangements, but empty of the emotional honesty their situation demanded. The children watched their parents' interaction with the sharp awareness that comes from living in a household where emotional undercurrents run strong. They could see that their father was sad, but also that he wasn't fighting to keep their mother home. George, in particular, seemed to age years in the span of that single conversation, as he realized that sometimes even parents couldn't protect the people they love from forces larger than themselves. The afternoon brought a parade of officials and lawyers, all speaking in the careful language of royal protocol while arranging the practical details of a family's destruction. Custody arrangements were discussed in terms that made the children sound like assets to be divided rather than human beings whose emotional well-being should be the primary concern. Catherine found herself agreeing to terms that felt like giving up pieces of her soul, but she knew that fighting would only prolong the children's agony. The children's reactions to the stream of strangers varied according to their personalities. George retreated into himself, becoming overly polite and formal in the way he had been taught to behave in public. Charlotte peppered the adults with questions they couldn't or wouldn't answer directly, her frustration growing with each evasive response. Louis simply clung to whichever parent was closest, sensing the tension without understanding its source. As evening approached, Catherine realized this would be her last dinner in the family home. The staff, many of whom had become genuinely fond of her over the years, served the meal with unusual attention to detail. It was as if they were trying to make this final family dinner special, even though everyone at the table knew it marked an ending rather than a celebration. The conversation at dinner was carefully neutral, focusing on the children's activities and interests rather than the enormous change that would take effect the next morning. But the effort to maintain normalcy only made the situation feel more surreal. Here they were, going through the motions of family life while everyone knew that in a few hours, that life would be over. After dinner, Catherine spent time with each child individually. With George, she talked about responsibility and how sometimes life presents challenges that seem unfair, but must be faced with courage and dignity. She reminded him that being the oldest meant he would need to help look after his siblings, but that he was still just a child and shouldn't feel responsible for adult problems. With Charlotte, the conversation focused on strength and independence. Catherine could see that her daughter was already trying to figure out how to fix the situation, how to bring the family back together through sheer force of will. She needed to understand that some problems couldn't be solved by determination alone, but that her strength would help her family get through this difficult time. Louis required a different approach entirely. At his age, abstract concepts like separation and custody were meaningless. Instead, Catherine focused on concrete reassurances. She would call every day. She would see him soon. She loved him more than all the stars in the sky. These were promises she prayed she would be able to keep. The bedtime routine that night felt both achingly familiar and completely different. The same stories, the same songs, the same kisses goodnight, but all performed with the knowledge that this was the last time they would happen in this house, in this configuration, as this family unit. Each child seemed to sense the finality of the moment, clinging a little longer, asking for one more story, one more song, anything to delay the inevitable tomorrow. After the children were finally asleep, Catherine returned to her study to finish her packing. The room looked strange now, emptied of her personal belongings, but still containing all the furniture and fixtures that had made it hers. Someone else would soon claim this space, would sit at this desk, would look out at the garden where her children played. The thought was almost unbearable. The final hours passed in a strange state of suspension. Catherine found herself moving through the house like a ghost, saying goodbye to spaces that had held so many memories. The morning room where she had drunk tea and read to the children. The conservatory where they had grown herbs for the kitchen. The library where she had spent countless hours helping with homework and sharing stories. As midnight approached, Catherine made one last check on the children. They were all sleeping peacefully, lost in dreams that still included their whole family living together in their familiar home. By tomorrow night, they would be sleeping in different beds, in a different house, beginning to adjust to a new reality that none of them had wanted or chosen. The suitcases sat by the door like silent sentinels, packed with the remnants of a life that had taken years to build and less than 2 days to dismantle. Catherine looked at them and realized that everything truly important to her couldn't be packed in luggage. Her children, her memories, her love for her family. These things would travel with her regardless of what she could carry. The house was finally quiet, but Catherine knew that sleep would not come easily. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pain, and the beginning of a journey she had never imagined she would have to take. But tonight, for these last few hours, she could still pretend that when morning came, they would all wake up as they had for years, together, safe and secure in their shared love. The final morning arrived with cruel sunshine, as if the world refused to acknowledge the darkness of the day. Catherine woke before dawn, having managed only a few hours of restless sleep. The house felt different already, charged with the tension of imminent change. Even the familiar sounds seemed muted, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The children woke slowly, each emerging from their rooms with the confused look of those who know something important is happening, but can't quite remember what. Louis appeared first, clutching his stuffed elephant, and looking for his mother with the automatic trust of a young child. When he found Catherine in the kitchen, making breakfast with hands that trembled slightly, he climbed on her lap without question, content to simply be close to her. George came down next, already dressed and composed in a way he had learned from watching his father navigate difficult public situations. But Catherine could see the worry in his eyes, the way he kept glancing toward her suitcases as if hoping they might have disappeared overnight. He sat at the breakfast table with unusual stillness, eating mechanically while his mind clearly worked through the implications of what was about to happen. Charlotte bounded downstairs with her usual energy, but it was forced, artificial. She chattered loudly about plans for the day, activities she wanted to do, games they could play, as if by filling the air with words, she could prevent the conversation they all knew was coming. Catherine recognized the strategy because she had used it herself many times, this desperate attempt to control a situation by controlling the narrative around it. Breakfast was a carefully choreographed affair. Catherine had prepared all their favorites: George's perfectly soft-boiled egg, Charlotte's toast cut into triangles with just the right amount of marmalade, Louis's porridge with honey drizzled into a smiley face. She moved through these familiar routines with extra attention to detail, knowing that these small acts of love might be her last opportunity to care for her children in this particular way. The children seemed to sense the significance of the moment, even Louis eating more slowly than usual, as if trying to make the meal last forever. They asked careful questions about her new apartment, whether she would have a garden, whether they could visit soon. Catherine answered as honestly as she could, painting a picture of temporary separation rather than permanent exile, though she wasn't entirely sure which version was closer to the truth. William appeared just as they were finishing breakfast, looking haggard from his own sleepless night. His presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room, adding a layer of formality that hadn't existed when it was just Catherine and the children. He kissed each child good morning with unusual intensity, holding them a little longer than necessary, and Catherine realized that he was struggling with this situation far more than he had allowed himself to show. The next hour passed in a blur of final preparations and delayed departures. Catherine kept finding reasons to double-check her packing, to make one more phone call, to have one more conversation with the children. Each delay was an attempt to hold onto these last moments of being together as a family unit, even though everyone knew that prolonging the inevitable would only make it more painful. Camilla made one final appearance, ostensibly to say goodbye, but really to ensure that Catherine understood there would be no last-minute reprieve. She spoke kindly to the children, playing the role of caring step-grandmother with practiced ease, but her eyes when they met Catherine's were cold and triumphant. This was her moment of complete victory, and she wanted Catherine to fully appreciate what she had lost. The actual moment of departure was both more and less dramatic than Catherine had anticipated. The children gathered in the front hall, watching as the driver loaded her suitcases into the car. Louis didn't fully understand what was happening and kept asking when Mummy would be back from her trip. Charlotte stood with her arms crossed, her jaw set in the stubborn expression she wore when she was trying not to cry. George positioned himself slightly in front of his siblings, as if his 9-year-old presence could somehow protect them from what was about to happen. Catherine knelt down to say goodbye to each child individually. With Louis, she kept her words simple and concrete. She loved him, she would see him soon, and Daddy would take good care of him. She gave him a special bracelet to remember her by, telling him to hold it whenever he missed her and know that she was thinking of him too. Charlotte's goodbye was more difficult because she understood exactly what was happening and wasn't willing to pretend otherwise. She demanded to know when they would see each other again, whether Catherine would still be their mother if she didn't live with them, and why Daddy couldn't just tell Grandma Camilla that this was wrong. Catherine answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging the unfairness of the situation while reassuring Charlotte that some things about family could never change, no matter what happened to where people lived. George's farewell was the hardest of all because he was trying so desperately to be brave for everyone else. He hugged his mother fiercely, but briefly, whispering that he would take care of Charlotte and Louis until she came back. The weight of responsibility in his young voice broke Catherine's heart, but she knew that feeling needed would help him cope with the separation. So she thanked him seriously and told him how proud she was of the young man he was becoming. William walked Catherine to the car, carrying one of her smaller bags with the careful attention he usually reserved for state occasions. They didn't speak much during those final moments, both aware that anything they said would be overheard by staff members who would repeat their words throughout the royal household within hours. Instead, they exchanged the kind of meaningful looks that couples develop over years of marriage, communicating volumes without saying anything at all. As the car pulled away from the house, Catherine turned to look back at her children. They were standing in the doorway with William, Louis held in his father's arms, while George and Charlotte flanked them on either side. The picture they made was both heartbreaking and beautiful, a family trying to hold itself together, even as one crucial piece was being taken away. The drive to London passed in a strange haze of familiar and unfamiliar sights. Catherine had made this journey countless times over the years, but never under circumstances like these. The countryside she had grown to love rolled past the car windows, but instead of feeling like a journey towards something exciting, this trip felt like an exile from everything that mattered. Her new apartment was small, but comfortable, located in a quiet part of London that offered both privacy and accessibility. Catherine had chosen it specifically because it felt like a place where the children would be comfortable when they visited, with enough space for them to play and adequate security to protect them from unwanted attention. As she walked through the rooms for the first time as a resident rather than a prospective tenant, she tried to envision her children there, tried to imagine how they would adapt to this new environment. The first few days passed in a fog of practical tasks and emotional adjustment. Catherine threw herself into making the apartment feel like home, arranging furniture and hanging pictures with the same attention to detail she had once applied to royal residences. She established routines for herself. Morning walks in the nearby park, regular phone calls to the children, evening hours spent reading or working on personal projects that had been impossible during her royal duties. The children's phone calls were both the highlight and the most painful part of each day. Louis would chatter about his daily activities with the resilient adaptability of a 4-year-old, seemingly adjusting to the new situation faster than anyone had expected. Charlotte was more guarded in their conversations, asking careful questions about Catherine's new life while sharing selective details about her own. George was the most difficult to read over the phone, his natural reserve making it hard to gauge how he was really coping with the separation. William called regularly as well, but their conversations were stilted and formal, limited by the awareness that their phone lines were likely monitored and their words would be analyzed by people whose job it was to watch for signs of reconciliation or continued conflict. They spoke about the children's schedules, their health and education, their emotional adjustment to the new situation. What they couldn't discuss was their own relationship, their shared grief over what they had lost, or their hopes for what might be possible in the future. The media attention was intense, but manageable thanks to careful preparation and legal agreements that limited what could be reported about the children. Catherine found herself the subject of intense speculation and analysis, with royal watchers debating everything from her clothing choices to her public expressions. She learned to navigate this attention with a combination of dignity and strategic invisibility, appearing in public when necessary, but maintaining enough privacy to begin healing from the trauma of the separation. 3 weeks after leaving the family home, Catherine received her first official visit from the children. William brought them to the apartment on a Saturday afternoon, and the reunion was both joyful and awkward. The children explored their mother's new space with curiosity and careful politeness, as if they were visiting a distant relative rather than their own parent. It took several hours for the artificial quality of the interaction to fade and for them to begin acting like themselves again. That first visit established a pattern that would define their new relationship. The children would come to stay every other weekend, with additional visits during school holidays and special occasions. Catherine learned to compress weeks' worth of mothering into these limited windows of time, making each moment count while trying not to appear desperate for their attention and affection. The apartment gradually transformed into a true second home for the children. Catherine made sure each child had their own space, their own belongings, their own sense of ownership in this new environment. She established traditions specific to their time together. Saturday morning pancakes, Sunday afternoon walks in the park, bedtime stories that were different from the ones they heard at their father's house. George adapted to the new arrangement with the same serious maturity he applied to all of life's challenges. He seemed to understand instinctively that his mother needed him to be okay. So he made an effort to engage fully during their time together while being supportive of his siblings' more volatile emotional reactions. Catherine could see the cost of this emotional management in the tired way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Charlotte struggled more visibly with the separation, cycling through anger, sadness, and determined optimism in ways that left everyone emotionally exhausted. She demanded detailed explanations for every aspect of the new arrangement, challenged rules that seemed arbitrary, and made elaborate plans for how the family could be reunited. Catherine admired her daughter's fighting spirit, while worrying about the emotional toll of refusing to accept their new reality. Louis, as expected, showed the most resilience, adapting to the split custody arrangement with the flexibility that came naturally to someone his age. He seemed to view the situation as having two different homes with different routines and advantages, rather than as a fundamental disruption to his family structure. His easy acceptance was both a relief and a source of guilt for Catherine, who wondered if his adaptability meant he was learning not to expect stability from the people who were supposed to provide it. 6 months after the separation, Catherine began to notice subtle changes in her children that worried her deeply. George had developed a habit of asking detailed questions about her daily routine when she didn't have them, as if he was trying to ensure she was taking proper care of herself in their absence. Charlotte had become fiercely protective of their time together, responding with unusual anger to any suggestion that their visits might be shortened or rescheduled. Louis had started asking when he could bring his friends to Mummy's house, apparently unaware that their living arrangement was considered temporary by everyone except him. The most concerning development was the way the children had learned to compartmentalize their lives. They spoke carefully about their time at their father's house when they were with Catherine, and she suspected they did the same when they were away from her. It was as if they had instinctively understood that their parents' relationship was too fragile to bear the weight of complete honesty about their experiences in each household. Catherine's own adjustment to single parenting was complicated by the very public nature of her situation. Every decision she made was scrutinized not just by the media, but by royal observers who saw her choices as reflecting on the monarchy itself. The school she chose for the children during their time with her, the activities she arranged, even the food she served them were all analyzed for their appropriateness and their potential political implications. The financial aspects of the separation had been resolved through negotiations that left Catherine comfortable but not independently wealthy. She had enough to maintain her apartment and provide for the children during their visits, but she was also acutely aware of how much her lifestyle had changed. The elaborate security arrangements, the staff support, the automatic access to any resource she might need, all of that had disappeared along with her royal status. William's visits to collect and deliver the children had evolved into brief, polite exchanges that revealed nothing of his emotional state or his feelings about their new arrangement. Catherine found herself studying his face during these interactions, looking for signs of regret or hope for reconciliation. But his expression remained carefully neutral. She wondered if he was under specific instructions about how to behave during these encounters, or if emotional distance had simply become his default mechanism for coping with an impossible situation. The children's relationship with their father seemed largely unchanged during Catherine's visits with them, but she began to notice small signs that they were struggling with divided loyalties. George sometimes mentioned conversations with his father that sounded like gentle interrogations about their time with Catherine. Charlotte had started asking pointed questions about why Daddy couldn't visit Mummy's apartment, as if she was testing various theories about the nature of the separation. Camilla's presence in the children's lives at their father's house was a constant source of tension for Catherine, though she was careful never to express her concerns directly to the children. They mentioned her frequently in their casual conversation, reporting her comments and activities with the unconscious acceptance that children show toward the adults in their daily environment. Catherine had to work hard to keep her responses neutral and supportive, even when the children's reports suggested that Camilla was actively undermining Catherine's parenting choices. The most difficult moments came when the children asked direct questions about the future of their family. Would Mummy and Daddy ever live together again? Was the separation permanent? Could they choose where to live when they got older? Catherine found herself walking a careful line between honesty and hope, wanting to prepare them for the possibility that their family might never be reunited while not crushing their natural desire for their parents to reconcile. As the first Christmas of their separation approached, Catherine faced the complicated logistics of sharing holidays with a family that no longer included her. The children would spend Christmas Eve and Christmas morning with their father, following royal traditions that dated back generations. Catherine would have them for the day after Christmas, creating new traditions that honored their changed circumstances while trying to maintain the magic of the holiday season. The negotiations around holiday arrangements revealed the continued complexity of Catherine's relationship with the royal family. While William was willing to be flexible about timing and logistics, every decision had to be approved by palace officials who seemed determined to minimize Catherine's role in any events that might be photographed or reported in the media. It became clear that her separation from the family was not just personal, but political, designed to gradually reduce her public presence and influence. Catherine spent Christmas Eve alone for the first time in over a decade, listening to carol services on the radio and trying not to imagine what her children were doing without her. She had prepared everything for their visit the next day, presents carefully chosen to delight without competing with what they would receive from their father's side of the family, a special meal that honored both tradition and their individual preferences, activities that would create new memories while acknowledging the sadness of not being together for the actual holiday. When the children arrived on Christmas afternoon, they were polite but subdued, clearly struggling with the strangeness of celebrating Christmas in two different places with two different sets of expectations. Catherine worked hard to create an atmosphere of joy and celebration, but she could see that they were emotionally exhausted from trying to manage everyone else's feelings about their situation. The breakthrough came when Louis, tired from the emotional demands of the day, had a complete meltdown about a toy that wasn't working properly. His frustrated tears seemed to give the older children permission to express their own feelings, and suddenly they were all crying together about how unfair and confusing everything had become. Catherine held them close, finally able to acknowledge openly that the situation was hard for everyone and that it was okay to be sad about it. That moment of shared honesty seemed to reset their dynamic, allowing them to enjoy the rest of their Christmas celebration without the artificial cheerfulness that had been exhausting them all. They spent the evening playing board games, reading stories, and making plans for how they would spend future holidays together. For the first time since the separation, they felt like a real family unit rather than people carefully managing a difficult situation. The new year brought increased pressure from royal officials about Catherine's future plans. There were subtle suggestions that she might be happier living abroad, perhaps in one of the Commonwealth countries, where she could maintain her privacy while still having access to her children during school holidays. Catherine recognized these suggestions for what they were: attempts to further distance her from the royal family and reduce her influence over her children's upbringing. Catherine's response was to become more involved in charitable work, focusing on causes that had always been important to her, but that she could now pursue without the constraints of royal protocol. She began working with organizations that supported families going through divorce and separation, using her own experience to help other parents navigate the emotional and practical challenges of maintaining relationships with children across divided households. This work gave Catherine a sense of purpose beyond her role as a mother, while also providing her with a support network of people who understood the unique challenges she faced. She met other mothers who were fighting to maintain relationships with their children despite difficult circumstances, and she found strength in their stories of resilience and determination. The children began to notice their mother's increased confidence and sense of purpose, and it seemed to reassure them that she was building a fulfilling life rather than simply waiting for their family to be reunited. George, in particular, seemed relieved to see that his mother was finding ways to be happy and productive during the time when she didn't have them with her. As spring approached, marking nearly a year since the separation began, Catherine realized that what had started as a temporary crisis was becoming a permanent way of life. The children had adapted to their dual household existence with remarkable resilience, developing strategies for maintaining close relationships with both parents despite the complex logistics and emotional challenges involved. The most significant change was in Catherine herself. The woman who had once defined herself primarily through her role as a royal wife and mother had discovered strengths and interests she hadn't known she possessed. She had learned to navigate single parenthood, to build a career independent of her royal connections, and to find happiness in smaller, more personal satisfactions than the grand public duties that had once filled her days. Looking toward the future, Catherine could see both challenges and opportunities ahead. The children would grow older and more able to understand the complex dynamics that had led to their family separation. They would eventually make their own choices about how much contact they wanted with each parent and how they wanted to structure their adult relationships with the royal family. For now, Catherine focused on being the best mother she could be within the constraints of their situation. She celebrated the children's achievements, comforted them through their difficulties, and worked to ensure that they felt loved and supported regardless of which household they were staying in at any given time. The apartment that had once felt like temporary housing had become a true home, filled with the accumulated memories of birthdays celebrated, homework completed, and quiet evenings spent together as a family unit that looked different from what they had once been, but was no less real or meaningful for its changed circumstances. Catherine had learned that love doesn't require everyone to live under the same roof, that families can be strong even when they're divided, and that sometimes the most important gift you can give your children is the example of how to build a good life from whatever circumstances you're given. The children were watching and learning, developing their own understanding of resilience, adaptation, and the many different ways that families can show love and support for each other. As she tucked Louis into bed during one of their weekends together, he looked up at her with the serious expression he wore when he was thinking about something important. "Mummy," he said, "I like having two houses. It means I get to have adventures in two different places." His simple acceptance of their situation reminded Catherine that sometimes children are better at adapting to change than adults, and that what felt like loss to her might simply represent a different kind of normal to them. The story of their separation would continue to unfold in ways that none of them could predict, but Catherine had learned to find peace in the present moment rather than anxiously anticipating an uncertain future. She had her children's love, her own strength, and the satisfaction of knowing that she had faced the worst crisis of her life with dignity and grace. Whatever came next, she would handle it one day at a time, one visit at a time, one moment of connection with her children at a time.